From September 9th through September 25th, we traveled through parts of Central Europe. Although, for much of our trip, we were seeking tourist attractions, we recognized that Central Europe played a significant role in Jewish history. So we made sure to include some visiting of Jewish-related sites. This is our story of Jewish Central Europe. First, however, a disclaimer. Most of the information we are presenting here came from guides that led tours on our trip. Most of the time they get it right, but sometimes they get it wrong. And we shall see several instances where different guides perceive the same event differently. On this trip, we traveled to and between several key cities in Central Europe. We toured sites of Jewish interest in these cities and learned a bit about Jewish history. But we also wanted to know what Jewish life is like presently in what used to be the center of Ashkenazi Jewish civilization. So, we made some efforts to meet with Jewish people as well. We begin our story in Prague. Our guide, Jana, began the tour of Jewish Prague by giving us a brief history of the Jewish quarter. It originally began in the 13th century as a ghetto in which Jews were forced to live. In 1780, however, guided by forces of the Enlightenment, Joseph II, king of the ruling Habsburg Empire, relaxed the restrictions placed on Jews. By 1800, Jews were allowed to move out of the ghetto. This exodus resulted in the clearing out of the ghetto and the destruction of many buildings. Most of the buildings currently in the Jewish quarter date from the late 19th to the earliest 20th century. Having no targets of military value, Prague was spared bombing during World War II, and many of the pre-war buildings remain. Jana told us that the Czech Republic is one of the most atheistic countries in the world, and as a consequence, there is not much anti-Semitism in the Czech Republic. Our meeting point, the Spanish Synagogue, was built in 1868 with an interior inspired by the Alhambra in Spain. Although a small group of Sephardim came to Prague after the 1492 expulsion from Spain, the synagogue, along with all the others in Prague, is Ashkenazi. Unfortunately, it was closed for renovation when we visited. A statue of the writer Franz Kafka stands next to the Spanish synagogue. Kafka grew up in Prague. As an adult, he worked in insurance, but his passion was writing. He felt that he was being carried throughout his life. Hence, the statue of him consists of a man being carried on a faceless individual's shoulders. According to our guide, the individual is his father, but no one knows for sure. The statue stands on the border between a synagogue and a church. This location represents Kafka's uncertainty as to where he belonged. The first of several synagogues that we visited was the Mazel Synagogue. Contrary to popular belief, it was not named after the amazing Mrs. Mazel, but rather after Mordecai Mazel, a leader of the Prague Jewish community. The building is no longer in use as a synagogue. It currently houses a video of a fly-through of an elaborate paper model of the Jewish quarter, constructed by Langweil in 1830. The next stop, the Pinchas Synagogue, contains much more somber displays. The synagogue is a Holocaust memorial, whose walls hold the names of Czech Holocaust victims, arranged in alphabetical order by town, with towns in alphabetical order as well. Some 85,000 names are written on the walls. Another wall contained the names of the Nazi concentration camps. The top floor, women's gallery of the synagogue, has a collection of drawings by children who were imprisoned in the Terezin concentration camp. It was chilling to realize that almost all of these children were eventually deported to one of the extermination camps and then murdered. Adjoining the Pinchas Synagogue is the old Jewish cemetery. The cemetery appears to be on a hill because the graves are stacked. The amount of land set aside for the cemetery was limited, so when the cemetery was filled, the graves were covered with a new layer of dirt, and more people could be buried. Perhaps the most famous resident of the cemetery is Rabbi Judah Löw, also called the Maharal. More about him later. Suffice it to say for now that his tomb is the most elaborate in the cemetery grounds. The next synagogue on the tour was the synagogue named the Alt Neu Shul, or Old New Synagogue. The synagogue received its unusual name in the following manner. An old synagogue existed in the neighborhood when this synagogue was built, so the new building was called the New Synagogue. Then, when a newer synagogue was built in the neighborhood, the new one became the New Synagogue, while the former New Synagogue became the Old New Synagogue. The logic defies belief. On the left, we see the synagogue exterior, while on the right, we see the interior. The tie-in with Rabbi Löw is that during an exceptionally difficult time for the Jews of Prague, Rabbi Löw played a note with the words of the Shema prayer between the lips of the golem, a clay monster who came to life to help the Jews. When the crisis was over, Rabbi Löw removed the note, and the monster returned to sleep in the attic of the synagogue. Legend has it that the golem is still there, but no one has been able to find him or her since Rabbi Löw's time. The final synagogue we visited on the tour was the Clausen Synagogue. Exhibits pertaining to Jewish life are displayed here. Our tour was formally over, so we then continued on to the Jerusalem Synagogue. The Jerusalem Synagogue was built outside the Jewish quarter in the mid-19th century. The interior of the synagogue is ornate, but disturbing to some was the continuous organ playing. In particular, one of the organ works was Johann Sebastian Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. Great piece of music. But in a synagogue? The next day, we visited Terezin. Terezin is a small town, approximately 65 kilometers north of Prague. It was founded by Empress Maria Theresa, hence the name Terezin, in order to stop a feared Prussian military invasion, so many military fortifications were built. However, these fortifications were never used to defend Prague because the feared Prussian invasion never took place. When World War II began, barracks were already in place, and the military fort was used as a jail to imprison people who violated the Nazi regime. In 1941, the Nazis began transporting Jews to Terezin. Terezin was used since it already had large barracks, which were used for imprisoning Jews, as well as the small fortress to imprison crimes against the state. Nonetheless, Terezin was still a concentration camp, created out of the perversity of the Nazi regime. From Terezin, a Jewish internee would, after a few weeks or months, be transported to an extermination camp, such as Auschwitz. A total of 80,000 Jews were transported to death camps, while another 30,000 died in Terezin. The memories of transportation to and from Terezin were so harsh that once the war ended, all train service to and from Terezin was terminated. Now, a bus makes the regular trips between Terezin and Prague. The Nazis found a new use for Terezin: propaganda. They would take visitors to Terezin and show them how well the prisoners were treated. They had plays, poetry readings, and soccer games. It must have been a most surreal environment. So surreal, in fact, that words cannot express the underlying horror of the camp. So we will illustrate the concentration camp story with pictures instead. Our visit to Terezin was a truly sobering experience. We also wanted to learn a bit about contemporary Jewish life in Prague, so on Friday night we attended a Shabbat service at Beit Simcha, a progressive synagogue in Prague. Progressive in Europe is equivalent to Reform in the United States. The synagogue was located in a nondescript building in the Jewish Quarter, a block from the Mazel Synagogue. There was no outward security, but we had to ring a doorbell to be let into the building. The service was led by a young man who was studying to be a cantor. It was mainly in Hebrew, but some of the readings were in English. We don't know if that was for our benefit or if it is their regular practice. We would estimate attendance to have been about 20 participants. A brief oneg after the service concluded the evening. A few days later, we were in Vienna, taking a tour of Jewish sites. Our guide, David, began the tour by giving us some background on Jewish Vienna. Vienna is divided into districts, which one can determine from the street signs. District 1, where our hotel was located, is also called the Schmata, Rags District, because of all the Jewish-owned garment factories that once were in the neighborhood. It is not at all that different from New York City's garment district. We learned that religion is taught in the schools, so those students who do not go to Jewish day schools receive their Jewish education at school and not in the congregation. Schools with large numbers of Jewish kids may have a rabbi on the premises to do the teaching. Jewish students from smaller schools would go to a central location for their religious education. Most Jews in Austria are Orthodox, but the level of observance may vary. Vienna has two Jewish museums, one funded by the city, the other funded by the Jewish community. Neither is supposed to be that good, according to David, and neither was included on the tour. The Judenplatz used to be the main square of the Jewish ghetto. In the center of the plaza is a statue of the writer Gotthold Lessing. Although Lessing was not Jewish, his main work, Nathan the Wise, has as its central character a Jewish merchant in the time of the Third Crusade, and is a plea for religious tolerance. Nathan was modeled after Lessing's friend, Moses Mendelssohn, the father of the Jewish Enlightenment. Also in the Judenplatz is a rather strange Holocaust memorial, a rectangular building symbolizing a living room with shelves of books, all turned around so their pages faced outward. We then visited the oldest synagogue in Austria. An inscription over the door, when the letters are converted to numbers, comes out to 1826, the year the synagogue was established. When the synagogue was built, the city made two requirements. The facades were not allowed to show the function of the building, and a leading architect had to be hired. In 1867, the Emperor, Franz Joseph, allowed Jews to practice their religion, and at one time the Jewish community in Vienna was the largest in the world. After World War II, Austria approached the Holocaust in a very different manner from Germany. Whereas Germany took immediate moral responsibility for its role in the Holocaust, started paying reparations, and initiated denazification, Austria viewed itself as the first of Hitler's victims and took no responsibility for its role in the Holocaust. We visited the monument against war and fascism. Stones on the monument were taken from the concentration camp at Mauthausen. A figure of a Jewish person was included in the monument, but the depiction offended many. We went to Shabbat services at Congregation Or Chadash, a progressive synagogue just north of the Danube River. Security was tighter there than in Prague. We had to sign in and show passports. The service was trilingual, Hebrew, German, and English. We were told later that a few of the prayers were read in English on behalf of visitors from English-speaking countries. Some of the melodies used in the liturgy were familiar, contemporary melodies, while others were unfamiliar, although the text was familiar to us. The Devar Torah was delivered in German, just like it was done in Reform congregations in the U.S. 150 years ago. After the service, we gathered in the social room where light hors d'oeuvres were served, and we had an opportunity to chat with members of the congregation. We learned that the overwhelming majority of Jews in Vienna were Orthodox, and that the progressive community was tolerated by the Jewish establishment, although not fully accepted. One person with whom George spoke, a history professor at the University of Vienna, thought that the tolerance of the progressive community was a response to threats of control of the community by the right-wing Haredim, ultra-Orthodox. Another congregant we spoke to was a woman of color, originally from Queens, New York, who was a concert pianist. All in all, it was a small, intelligent, and open community with which we shared Shabbat, and quite welcoming to its guests from overseas. As we waited for our Uber outside the front of the building, we were cautioned to speak softly, as the people who lived above were known to throw water on noisy congregants. Oi. Our final destination was Budapest, Hungary. A Holocaust memorial placed near the Hungarian Parliament building is billed as a monument against Nazi occupation. Hungary has not yet come to grips with its role in the Holocaust, viewing its Hungarians as victims of the Nazis rather than as collaborators. But not everyone agrees with that depiction of the Holocaust. Also posted near the monument was a note protesting the information that was being displayed. The title of the note reads, "Civilians Protest Against Monument Falsifying History." And it appears they are also having issues with vandals. The next day, we took a Jewish tour of Budapest. Our guide told a different story about the Holocaust. Contrary to the official story told by Hungary, deportation of Jews began in 1941, several years before the Nazis took over Hungary, and the deportations were run by Hungary. According to our guide, the Hungarians were just as complicit as the Nazis, only Hungary won't admit it. With that in mind, we visited the Holocaust Memorial on the grounds of the Dohány Street Synagogue. A tree of life records the names of Hungarian Jews who died in the Holocaust. A monument marker sits next to the tree of life. As is the custom, stones are placed on the monument marker. On the marker is the Hungarian word for "let us remember." Also identified are righteous Gentiles, non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish lives. The most famous one, of course, is Raoul Wallenberg, who, while working in the Swedish embassy, issued many Swedish visas to Jews, allowing them to emigrate. Wallenberg was imprisoned by the Russians when they overran Hungary and was never heard from again. There were other less well-known Gentiles who also saved Jews, such as Giorgio Perlasca. Perlasca was an Italian businessman who, while posing as the Spanish consul general, saved many Jewish children. In 1859, the Dohány Street Synagogue opened. The congregation belongs to the Neolog movement, which is very similar to conservative Judaism in the United States. The building was designed by Christians based on what the architects believed a good church should look like. In the early 19th century, during Hungary's independence movement, Christians and Jews banded together. At that time, Jews declared themselves to be Hungarian and were accepted into the wider Hungarian society. The two main Jewish denominations in Hungary are Orthodox and Neolog. The Neolog movement wanted its practices to be similar to that of churches, so mixed seating was allowed. After World War I, Hungary lost much of its territory. So, when Hitler promised that Hungary would recover the territory it had lost, the Hungarians jumped at the opportunity and began imprisoning Jews. More than 400,000 Jews died in World War II, leaving some 100 to 200,000 Jews in Hungary today. The number is vague because many people choose not to identify themselves as Jews. There is little formal Jewish education in Hungary outside of Jewish day schools. Most Jewish education comes from the family, and many families hold off letting their children know they are Jewish until they are old enough to deal with the likely anti-Semitism they might encounter. We next visited a much more modest Orthodox synagogue. A Judaica shop was next door, and a Jewish museum was a block away. The museum is less than 2 years old and depicts a Jewish home around the turn of the 20th century. To close our visit of Jewish Central Europe, we walked to the Danube River to view the shoes on the Danube bank. The shoes on the Danube bank is a memorial to Jews murdered by the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian militia that collaborated with the Nazis. Victims were forced to stand on the banks of the river and remove their shoes before being shot. Their bodies fell into the river and were carried downstream. Seeing the shoes was very difficult, especially seeing the shoes of small, innocent children. Memorial candles and stones were placed in shoes in memory of those murdered. We learned a great deal about Central European Jewry from this trip. Central Europe has had a long Jewish history, once being the center of the world's Ashkenazic Jewish community. This community was almost, but not completely exterminated during the Holocaust. Few countries accepted responsibility for their roles as persecutors in the Holocaust, instead viewing themselves as victims of Nazi persecution. Although there appears to be little overt anti-Semitism, Jews are cautious, and there is often enhanced security around Jewish establishments. Other than Jewish day schools, Jewish education for children appears to be somewhat weak. The progressive reform movement in what used to be the Habsburg Empire is not as significant as it is in the U.S. Most Central European Jews, in fact, are Orthodox. Thank you very much for listening.